give you a little secret. There are 9 candidates, 8 of them's gonna lose. It's not gonna be 8 winners and Al lose. It's gonna be 1 winner and 8 losers. I intend to be the 1 winner so we can have, for the first time in history, 2 Al's win an election in a row. I just want to be inaugurated after I win mine. Thank you, and God bless.
With the 2004 presidential race by watching Road to the White House, our weekly look at the candidates, issues, and events shaping the campaign. It airs every Sunday at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. Eastern and Pacific, here on C-SPAN. Coming up tonight on C-SPAN, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz testifies about the Pentagon budget and the cost of a war with Iraq at a House Budget Committee hearing. After that, remarks from some of the members of the UN Security Council following today's closed meeting on Iraq. Now that hearing with Paul Wolfowitz. This portion's about 2 hours.
Committee will come to order. Today's hearing will examine the Department of Defense budget request for fiscal year 2004. Our witnesses will be the Honorable Paul D. Wolfowitz, Deputy Secretary of Defense. Appearing with Secretary Wolfowitz will be Dov Zakheim, the Undersecretary of Defense and Chief Financial Officer. Also appearing will be Stephen Kosiak, Director of Budget Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. In the face of unprecedented threats to our domestic and international security, the defense budget must advance 3 overarching goals: to win the global war on terrorism, to invest in the procurements and people needed to sustain that effort, and to transform the Cold War military structure to meet the 21st century demands. The President said his aim was, quote, to move beyond marginal improvements to replace existing programs with new technologies and strategies, end quote. He said securing our common defense will require spending more and spending more wisely. The fiscal year 2004 defense budget requests more. This committee and others will have to decide if the department is capable of moving beyond marginal, often glacier reforms to the wiser spending the President demands. We are at war. Terrorism is being uprooted in Afghanistan. It appears more likely with each passing day Saddam Hussein will persist in refusing to comply with the United Nations, and that the United States will be required to lead a coalition of willing nations to disarm him. This budget reflects this committee's commitment and the commitment of every American that the brave men and women of our military will have every resource they need in the difficult months and years to come. One specific area raises concerns in that regard: individual protective equipment against chemical and biological weapons. The Government Reform Subcommittee on National Security, which I chair, was told last year of significant procurement shortfalls in key CB defense items. The Department's own 2002 report on the CB defense program pointed to high risk now and in the out years due to a lagging procurements of modern protective garments, boots, gloves, and collective protection shelters. I am concerned this budget does too little to close the gap between what it will take to protect U.S. forces on the contaminated battlefield of the future and the equipment we will be able to give them. Nor does this budget appear to make any bold new steps towards solving the long festering dilemma of how to pay for all the tactical aircraft procurements now underway. More money for fewer planes is not a wise fiscal policy, nor will it address the problem of an aging air fleet. This committee has consistently provided the resources our armed forces have needed to do their job, including the $10 billion war reserve that was appropriated until this month. That was not appropriated until this month. Despite the controversy surrounding the appropriation of an undefined request, this committee was willing to step up to the plate and provide the Department of Defense with the flexibility it asked for and to do it in a timely fashion. It is noteworthy and perhaps paradoxical that DoD officials have described the fiscal year 2004 budget request as a peacetime budget. The reason, of course, is that the administration's budget does not include the cost of potential conflict with Iraq. We all know there are great uncertainties about the cost of disarming Saddam Hussein, uncertainties that make it difficult to put a precise number on the cost of possible military operations. But this committee still needs to learn all it can about those costs. Just yesterday, the White House released Pentagon estimates that the war and its immediate aftermath will cost between $60 and $95 billion. Today, Washington Post reports that some internal administration estimates show the cost growing above $100 billion. It is worth noting that the 1991 Persian Gulf War cost $82.5 billion in current dollars, which brings me to another critical subject, burden sharing. In the Gulf War, the United States received financial contributions of over $48 billion from our allies. This time, we are being presented with a bill in advance from countries I would argue will greatly and directly benefit from a regime change in Iraq. We have already agreed to a $15 billion aid package to Turkey in exchange for the rights to base American troops there, and we may also be increasing our aid to Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and others. The bottom line is we need a better and fuller understanding of the financial commitments we are undertaking and how much these costs our allies are willing to bear. Finally, there is the big picture. Is the Pentagon's budget plan the right one for a long-term operations? Will it achieve the bold transformation progress the President envisions, or will service rivalries and trends and inefficiencies soak up any additional spending to feed a sluggish but voracious status quo? That said, I want to repeat our assurance that this committee will do everything in its power to assure that the men and women of our armed forces will receive the tools and the training they need to defeat terrorism and ensure the safety of this nation. We look forward to your testimony, Mr. Secretary, and at this time I would recognize Mr. Spratt and announce to our members that the Undersecretary needs to leave here at 4 o'clock. I will be very strong on the 5-minute rule, which doesn't mean you ask a question for 5 minutes and then give him 5 minutes to answer. All right.
Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Spratt.
Secretary. I usually see you in my other capacity as a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and since today I'm wearing my budget hat, I want to express some budget and fiscal concerns. The Department of Defense is now in the middle of the largest sustained buildup in 20 years. Your 6-year plan, we call it the FIDUP, associated with its 2004 budget, would leave the defense budget one-third larger in real terms at the end of that plan in 2009 than it was when the administration took office. We haven't seen an increase of this size since the Cold War during President Reagan's first term. Much of that increase has already taken place. It's committed since the budget for national defense has increased from $300 billion in fiscal 2000 to at least $400 billion by the time we finish fiscal 2003, or 3 short years. This budget proposal, therefore, proposes to increase that to $500 billion by the year 2009. Let me make clear, all of us support a strong national defense. We're certainly going to put forward the funds necessary for the United States to work its policies in the world. And most of all, we're going to support our men and women in uniform and say, thank God there are such men and women who will go in an hour like this in harm's way and defend the United States of America. They're being asked to do Herculean feats around the world, night and day, and we will not let them down. We will support them. Unfortunately, the increases in defense that you're requesting are being financed by deficit spending. And the bills for national defense, ultimately, when you charge it to the deficit, get charged to our children and grandchildren. The fiscal year 2004 budget proposes the largest deficit in American history, $307 billion, and now projects a deficit of over $300 billion in 2003 as well. The 10-year surplus of $5.6 trillion, which was projected back in 2001, has been wiped out. That's the message that CBO gave us just a few weeks ago, and then OMB confirmed it. Between now and 2011, the administration's policies, and particularly the new tax cuts, would add an additional $2 trillion to that public debt. As bad as that sounds, it's likely to get worse. Data from the Treasury Department indicates that during the first few months of fiscal 2003, revenues are off 8%. You've sent us a budget that has nothing in it for the war in Iraq, to which I understand why you wouldn't make that particular request, but you also included nothing for the global war against terrorism, and in particular against Afghanistan, and I'm at a loss to understand why that was not included in this particular budget request. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal contains this news that the Bush administration is preparing to submit supplemental spending requests totaling as much as $95 billion for a war with Iraq, its aftermath, and new expenses to fight terrorism. Today, the New York Times reported that Pentagon officials said yesterday that the military's part of the cost over the next several months through this fiscal year at least, would be $60 billion. And of course, these are just a portion of the cost. We're reading about deals that are being cut with Turkey and other allies that we have no way of scoring or keeping a tab on. We don't really know what the cumulative cost of this effort is likely to be. I hope that today's hearing will give us better insight into the real costs that we're facing, because it's this committee's responsibility to put things in the stark light of fiscal reality. Today, we're not in a position to do that because there's so many significant things we just don't know about this budget. If the estimated cost of additional spending for Iraq of $95 billion turns out correct, that would push the deficit for 2003 up to $400 billion, by far the largest ever recorded. Even if the lower figure of $60 billion is more accurate, that'll still give us the largest deficit in constant dollars since World War II was over. Finally, as bad as the situation is today, we have to think about the long term. And really, the retirement of the baby boomers is not long term. It begins in 2008. They draw Social Security then. In 2011, they start drawing Medicare. And we're going to see a demographic change in this budget that is going to be phenomenal. And the question is, can we sustain this buildup in the face of the retiring baby boomers? I put these hard questions to you because these are questions we should be asking you, asking ourselves, and trying to resolve in the budgets that we'll be preparing in the weeks ahead. Thank you for coming. We look forward to your answers to our questions.
Mr. Secretary, we're going to hear from you. If we finish your statement in some time, we have an hour and a half for questions. We could potentially get everyone in this room being able to ask a question. But if you don't need to use the 5 minutes, please don't. Okay? Mr. Wolfowitz, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will just read portions of my testimony and submit the entire testimony for the record.
And without objection, that will happen.
Mr. Chairman, this is a large budget that we are requesting, $379.9 billion. But I'd like to begin by pointing out that by historical standards, this budget is a sustainable defense burden, one that is significantly less than the burden we sustained throughout the Cold War. Moreover, this is a wartime defense budget, although it is fair to point out that some possible war costs are not included, particularly those that would be associated if we have a conflict in Iraq. But if I could have, and I think we rearranged the charts in the wrong order, could I have the chart that shows the percent of GDP that goes to defense historically? You'll see that in FY 2004, DoD outlays are projected, even with the unfortunate economic situation, to be at 3.4% of our gross domestic product. That's well below its level at any time during the Cold War, much less the peak during the Cold War. Similarly, if you compare it to total federal outlays, it is 16.6%, again, well below its level at any time. I underscore any time during the Cold War. Another fact to remember when one thinks about whether these are controllable costs is that about 45% of the defense budget goes to cover the personnel costs for our magnificent men and women in uniform and for the civilians who support them. Despite great efforts to try to limit increases in personnel, we have had to activate a significant number of reservists and National Guardsmen to meet our warfighting tasks. It is hard to imagine at this time how we could reduce costs by cutting force structure and people. The proposed $15.3 billion increase over last year is sizable, but each year much of any Defense Department increase is consumed by what we call fact-of-life increases, specifically pay raises and non-pay inflation. In the FY 2004 request, over $8.5 billion of the $15 billion increase goes to inflation and non-pay inflation and to increases in military and civilian pay. $4.2 billion in pay increases, and $4.3 billion in non-pay inflation. Some critics, I read, say the U.S. defense budget is higher than it needs to be because it exceeds that of all our possible adversaries combined. But it's not. It is our task to defend against real threats, Mr. Chairman, not against budget accounts. The defense budget of the Taliban was an insignificant fraction of ours, yet that regime proved to be a major threat to the United States. And it was thanks to the overwhelming superiority of our forces that we were able to achieve our objectives in that country in miraculously short order and with miraculously low casualties. Indeed, when we send our forces into combat, we want them to have that kind of overwhelming advantage that minimizes casualties and provides for decisive victories, not just the bare margin necessary for a close win. The only reasonable evaluation of a U.S. defense budget is its ability to cover the full range of uncertain risks that threaten America's vital interests. Besides their horrific toll, let's remember that the attacks of September 11th cost our nation billions of dollars in both physical destruction and damage to our economy. Direct costs of September 11th are already estimated to exceed $100 billion. Another such catastrophe could cost far more, especially if attackers use weapons of mass terror. The President's defense budget is sustainable because, first, we have insisted on realistic budgeting, especially for acquisition programs and readiness requirements. And secondly, because we have made many hard choices in this budget to ensure that our programs are executable within their projected top lines. For the FYDP of 2004 to 2009, the Department has shifted over $80 billion from previous budget plans into acquisition programs that support a strategy of transforming our military. These hard choices will reduce the cost risks to the DoD top line that were highlighted in a recent Congressional Budget Office report. That report was done before it could reflect the work that we did in preparing this budget request. Our commitment to realistic budgeting includes properly funding investment programs based on independent cost estimates. This practice not only protects our future readiness, it also protects our near-term readiness because training and operations funds are no longer a bill payer for underfunded investment programs as they were throughout much of the last decade. Let me say a little bit about funding the costs of war. The same rigorous planning and tough decision-making used in our budget preparation are being applied to our execution of the war on terrorism and to plans and preparations for the possibility of a war in Iraq. Our military and civilian planners are working hard to ensure that our scarce personnel and budgetary resources are directed to the highest priorities and that all alternatives are exhaustively assessed. Nevertheless, any war is fraught with uncertainty, and that makes all predictions of future war costs extremely uncertain. The President's proposed budget does not estimate the incremental costs of a possible war with Iraq, nor does it request contingency funding to cover them. Such estimates are so dependent on future unpredictable circumstances as to be of little value. We are, however, doing everything possible in our planning now to make post-war recovery smoother and less expensive should the use of force become necessary. As in Afghanistan, we would seek and expect to get Allied contributions, both in cash and in kind, particularly for the reconstruction effort in a post-Saddam Iraq. If I might digress for a moment, Mr. Chairman, from my prepared testimony, because there's been a good deal of comment, some of it quite outlandish, about what our post-war requirements might be in Iraq. That great Yankee catcher and occasional philosopher, Yogi Berra, once observed that it's dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future. That piece of wise advice certainly applies to predictions about wars and their aftermath. And I am reluctant to try to predict anything about what the cost of a possible conflict in Iraq would be, or what the possible costs of reconstructing and stabilizing that country afterwards might be. But some of the higher-end predictions that we have been hearing recently, such as the notion that it will take several 100,000 U.S. troops to provide stability in post-Saddam Iraq, are wildly off the mark. First, it's hard to conceive that it would take more forces to provide stability in post-Saddam Iraq than it would take to conduct the war itself and to secure the surrender of Saddam's security forces and his army. Hard to imagine. Second, in making predictions, one should at least pay attention to past experience. And in the case of Iraq, we have some recent experience to look to. The northern third of Iraq has been liberated from Saddam Hussein's grasp since Operation Provide Comfort, which we undertook just 1 month after the ceasefire in the Persian Gulf War in 1991. By the way, our current Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Jim Jones, was a colonel commanding Marine Battalion in that operation. After that operation, we withdrew our ground forces from northern Iraq completely in the fall of 1991, and in the 12 years since then, we have not had any forces, I emphasize any forces, on the ground there. And yet the northern third of Iraq has remained reasonably stable, even though sadly it is subjected to the same economic sanctions that have been applied to the rest of the country, and even though the people there live under daily threat from Saddam's military, from Saddam's security forces, and for the last year and a half from an al-Qaeda cell that operates in northeastern Iraq called Ansar al-Islam. In fact, even the U.S. air presence, which we have maintained over northern Iraq, has not been necessary to keep peace among the people of northern Iraq, but to keep Saddam Hussein out. There are other differences that suggest that peacekeeping requirements in Iraq might be much lower than historical experience in the Balkans suggests. There's been none of the record in Iraq of ethnic militias fighting one another that produced so much bloodshed and permanent scars in Bosnia, along with a continuing requirement for large peacekeeping forces to separate those militias. And the horrors of Iraq are very different from the horrific ethnic cleansing of Kosovars by Serbs that took place in Kosovo, and the left scars that continue to require peacekeeping forces today in Kosovo. The slaughter in Iraq, and it's been substantial, has unfortunately been the slaughter of people of all ethnic and religious groups by the regime. It is equal opportunity terror. Third, whatever numbers are required, and I emphasize, I'm not trying to make a prediction, but I will say there is simply no reason to assume that the United States will or should supply all of those forces. Many countries have already indicated to us, some of them privately, a desire to help in reconstruction of post-Saddam Iraq, even though they may not want to be associated with Saddam's forcible removal. Indeed, remember that we're talking about one of the most important countries in the Arab world, with not only enormous natural resources that we keep hearing about, but equally importantly, I would say more importantly, extraordinary human resources. And I would expect that even countries like France will have a strong interest in assisting Iraq's reconstruction. Moreover, the Iraqis themselves can provide a good deal of whatever manpower is necessary. We are already training free Iraqi forces to perform functions of that kind, including command of Iraqi units once those units have been purged of their Ba'athist leadership. But the fourth and most fundamental point is that we go back to Yogi Berra. We simply cannot predict. We have no idea whether weapons of mass terror will be used. We have no idea what kind of ethnic strife might appear in the future, although, as I've noted, it has not been the history of Iraq's recent past. We do not know what kind of damage Saddam Hussein will wreak on Iraq's oil fields or on its other infrastructure. On the other side, we can't be sure that the Iraqi people will welcome us as liberators, although based on what Iraqi Americans told me in Detroit a week ago, many of them, most of them with families in Iraq, I am reasonably certain that they will greet us as liberators, and that will help us to keep requirements down. In short, we don't know what the requirement will be, but we can say with reasonable confidence that the notion of hundreds of thousands of American troops is way off the mark. I'd like to add also that there is a danger in making single-point estimates. It's not just an intellectual and analytical danger that you can't predict the future. This is a particularly bad time to be publishing specific numbers because official numbers become part of our declaratory policy, and single-point estimates right now about the possible costs of a conflict or about the possible length and duration, length and size of a post-war reconstruction effort could be misinterpreted. Think about that issue. The best estimate of what we will need post-Saddam Hussein is what the President and Secretary Powell and Secretary Rumsfeld have been saying. We will stay as long as necessary, and leave as soon as possible. I understand that that is a frustrating estimate for people who want a single-point estimate of the future, but it is the truth. Moreover, stop and think about it from an Iraqi point of view. They want to know that they won't be abandoned, that we will do what is needed for post-war reconstruction. For that purpose, large numbers for long periods of time have a reassuring quality. On the other hand, they also want to know that we are coming as liberators and not as occupiers. From that point of view, they would prefer to hear that we won't be there in large numbers for very long. Fundamentally, we have no idea what is needed unless and until we get there on the ground. There will be appropriate times for making public estimates along with a range of assumptions that lead to them. But this delicate moment, when we are assembling a coalition, when we are mobilizing people inside Iraq and throughout the region to help us in the event of war, and when we are still trying through the United Nations and by other means to achieve a peaceful solution without war, is not a good time to publish highly suspect numerical estimates and have them drive our declaratory policy. Let me say something else, if I may, Mr. Chairman, to put the costs of war into some context, and then I'll wrap up with one other comment. The possible cost of war in Iraq ought to be considered in the context of America's other international undertakings of recent years. We must remember there is a cost of containment in both dollars as well as risks to our national security. We've been doing some preliminary estimates, and I emphasize they are preliminary, and until I'm confident of the assumptions, I wouldn't want to swear by them. But our preliminary estimates is that it's cost us slightly over $30 billion to maintain the containment of Saddam Hussein for the last 12 years. And it's cost us far more than money, because as I think many of you know, it is that American presence in the holy land of Saudi Arabia and the sustained American bombing of Iraq as part of that containment policy that has been Osama bin Laden's principal recruiting device, even more than the other grievances he cites. I can't imagine anyone here wanting to spend another $30 billion to be there for another 12 years to continue helping recruit terrorists. Furthermore, it's worthwhile to consider what we might spend on reconstruction in Iraq against what we've already spent in Bosnia and Kosovo. Again, these are very preliminary estimates, but the estimates already so far in Bosnia and Kosovo are that we've spent something between $12 and $15 billion. I think that is a worthwhile expenditure, but our purposes in those two places are largely humanitarian. Iraq presents a case of direct threat to the security of the United States and our allies, and a key to the future of one of the most important regions in the world. Indeed, I believe the most significant cost associated with Iraq, which is very, very difficult to estimate, is the cost of doing nothing. The simple truth is, disarming Iraq and fighting the war on terror are not merely related. Disarming Iraq's arsenal of terror is a crucial part of winning the war on terror. If we can disarm or defeat Saddam's brutal regime in Baghdad, it will be a defeat for terrorists globally. And the value of such a victory against a terrorist regime will be of incalculable value in the continuing war on terrorism. Mr. Chairman, let me spare you a good deal of the rest. You can read it, but I would like to just have a minute on this important issue of transforming the business of defense. We are working hard to not only spend more as we are doing, but to spend more wisely. Much has happened as the President directed us to do. Much has happened in the last 2 years within our department to realize the President's mandate. But we also have a challenge that we share with you. In consultation with members of Congress, including members on this committee and many more that we hope to talk to in coming weeks, we are trying to develop an agenda for change that both the executive branch and the Congress can agree on, that will streamline and modernize how the Department of Defense manages people, buys weapons, uses training ranges, and manages money. In an age when terrorists move information at the speed of an email and money at the speed of a wire transfer, the Defense Department is bogged down in the micromanagement and bureaucratic processes of the industrial age. We have created a culture that too often stifles innovation. The major obstacles faced by us all in making the broad transition that is necessary include reforming an antiquated personnel structure, both civilian and military, increasing flexibility in managing money and managing the department, reforming broken acquisition processes and requirements and resource processes, Mr. Chairman, we are fighting the first wars of the 21st century with a Defense Department that was fashioned to meet the challenges of the mid-20th century. We have an industrial age organization, but we are living in an information age world where new threats emerge suddenly, often without warning, to surprise us. Last year, Congress and the administration faced up to the fact that our government was not organized to deal with the new threats to the American homeland and created a new Department of Homeland Security. We must now address the Department of Defense. Many of the obstacles we face today are self-imposed. Where we have the authority to fix those problems, we're working hard to do so. For example, we are modernizing our financial management structures to replace some 1,900 information systems. We're doing many things, and even more than I've had mentioned in my testimony. But to get the kind of agility and flexibility required in the 21st century security environment, we also need some legislative relief, and for that we need your help. We must work together, Congress and the administration, to transform not only the U.S. Armed Forces, but the Defense Department that serves them and prepares them for battle. The lives of the servicemen and women in the field and of our friends and families here at home depend on our ability to do so. Mr. Chairman, let me conclude with that, and unless Mr. Zakhandov, do you want to add anything? I think you want to get to your questions.
No, I do. Mr. Secretary, first, in my desire to be efficient, I didn't truly welcome you here. It's an honor to have you here, and we thank you for your service to your country over so many years. I want to put that on the record. Given that I had an opening statement, I'm going to pass on questions to give other members time, and I'm going to go to Mr. Gutnick, then Mr. Spratt, and then Mr. Thornberry. And I'll be pretty strict with the 5 minutes, gentlemen and ladies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think I speak on behalf of the entire committee. Mr. Wolfowitz, we appreciate your service to the country, and frankly, in your statement, I think you expressed as clearly, or probably far more clearly than any of us could, how important it is to do what needs to be done with the regime in Baghdad. And I think most Americans now believe that something has to happen, and unfortunately, I think it's left to we, the Americans, to do it. The chairman, in his opening statement, referred to two frustrating factors that I hope you will comment on. One is some of the other commitments, and I realize that that has more to do with your colleagues down at the State Department, but we have all witnessed what I think is a rather unseemly auction with some of our allies, particularly with Turkey. And the concern we have is that there may be people inside the administration that are writing checks that the Congress may not be too eager to cash. Can you talk a little bit about some of those other commitments and whether or not you and the people down at the Pentagon have had something to say about that?
We've had a great deal to say about it, and let me say, I know some of what you read in the press sounds unseemly, and some of what some other people say is unseemly. I think the notion that somehow we owe Turkey $92 billion for the last 12 years of what they've been through is just way off the mark, way off the mark. But a great deal of what we're talking about is very seemly and quite appropriate in the context of fighting a war on terrorism with countries that really are standing up to the challenges, and sometimes countries that are not in a great position to do so. Think about Pakistan, for example. Pakistan has done a great deal for us. We could not possibly have accomplished our objectives in Pakistan. At the moment, to be honest, we're behind in paying our bills to the Pakistanis for the support they're giving to our forces. We're working hard to get that done, and we're hoping actually in this year's program to get a little more flexibility so that we don't fall behind in paying absolutely legitimate bills. The issue with Turkey, and I want to be cautious here because we're at an absolutely critical stage in our negotiations with them, and there's a tendency to take anything I say and use it for whatever purpose anyone wants to. But it isn't a question of how valuable Turkey is and bidding and auction and so forth. It is a fact that Turkey has great reason to be concerned that if there is a conflict in Iraq, they're going to sustain some significant short-term economic costs and burdens. It's also a fact that they were promised some things in 1991, some by us and some by Arab countries, and only some of those promises were delivered. There's been a tendency to mythologize those afterwards, and they become much bigger, but there is some grounds for concern on their part. It does seem to me that we need to get out of the bargaining stage and get on with this, because the fact is that whatever short-term costs Turkey suffers, and there will be short-term costs, the long-term benefits to Turkey of ending the economic sanctions on Iraq, and let me emphasize that's another great benefit that will come to the whole region and the people of Iraq, is that there will no longer be economic sanctions, obviously, with Saddam gone. The long-term benefits to Turkey's economy are enormous. And if Turkey helps us, they're not only helping us, they're helping themselves. We can achieve our objectives with or without Turkey, but we will achieve them much faster, with much less economic cost to the region, with much less political disturbance in the region, and most importantly, with less risk to American and other lives, if we can confront Saddam Hussein with a two-front war rather than just a one-front. That's why it's important to have Turkey with us. I think the Turks are close to understanding that, but it is, at the end of the day, about our mutual security and not about a bazaar.
Let me also mention something else the Chairman mentioned. That is the burden sharing, and that's something that I think we have been awfully slow to negotiate with many of our allies. And I would remind you that in the last exchange we had with Saddam Hussein, we were able to get our allies to pick up, under some accounting, literally 100% of our direct costs. Mm-hmm. Have we had any luck to this point getting any of our allies to step forward and say they would be willing to help share some of the burden this time?
We've definitely had quite a bit of luck in Afghanistan, and Dr. Zakheim can go into more detail. He's been all around the world soliciting cash and assistance in kind. As you know, the International Peacekeeping Force in Kabul is entirely non-American except for a few officers. It was led first by the British, then by the Turks, now by the Dutch and Germans. I played a very big role in the fundraising effort the last time around.
I'm going to just cut you off there if you don't mind.
Okay. I'll come back to it whenever you want to. It's an important question.
Yeah, let me just say, if you can incorporate it in an answer, the burden sharing's out there, but the bottom line is a yes to them, and you'll give us more details, hopefully fill it into the other questions. We're going to go to Mr. Spratt, then Thornberry, and then Moran.
Mr. Secretary, yesterday the Washington Post said administration officials said the Pentagon's estimate of $60 to $95 billion for a war and its immediate aftermath was certain to be eclipsed when the long-term cost of occupation, reconstruction, foreign aid, and humanitarian relief were figured in. President Bush was briefed on the war cost Tuesday and is scheduled to receive detailed budget scenarios in the next week or two, officials said. Is that an accurate account?
It may be an accurate account of what some anonymous administration officials said, but I don't think he knows.
That was my next question. Are we looking at the
I don't think he knows what he's talking, or he or she knows what they're talking about. I mean, I think the idea that it's going to be eclipsed by these monstrous future costs ignores the nature of the country we're dealing with. It's got already, I believe, on the order of $15 to $20 billion a year in oil exports, which might finally be turned to good use instead of building Saddam's palaces. It has one of the most valuable, undeveloped sources of natural resources in the world. And let me emphasize, if we liberate Iraq, those resources will belong to the Iraqi people, but they will be able to develop them and borrow against them. It is a country that has somewhere between, I believe, over $10 billion, let me not put a number on it, in an escrow account run by the United Nations. It's a country that has $10 to $20 billion in frozen assets from the Gulf War, and I don't know how many billions that are closeted away by Saddam and his henchmen. There's a lot of money there, and to assume that we're going to pay for it is just wrong.
The $60 to $90 billion cost estimate is consistent with what staff on this committee have developed in the past year. It's just a bit above what the Congressional Budget Office projected would be the cost of such a war based on the cost in 1990. Is it in your ballpark also?
Congressman Spratt, I would go back to what I said at greater length in my opening statement. The ballpark is so wide that it fits almost any number you want to pick out of the air. It depends on the assumptions. It depends on how long the war lasts. It depends on whether weapons of mass destruction are used. It depends very importantly on whether the Iraqi army turns on Saddam Hussein, which I think is a distinct possibility, or whether some important pieces of it decide to fight. It is so dependent on assumptions that picking a number or even a range of numbers is precarious. Furthermore, in answer to Congressman Gutenek's question, before the Gulf War in 1991, we had the whole world asking us to do the job of liberating Kuwait. Because the political situation at the time was such, my office initially proposed, let's get some help from our allies. We organized what became known as Operation Tin Cup. We got, as I remember, $12 billion from the Japanese, a comparable number from the Germans, huge amounts from the Saudis, from the Kuwaitis, from the United Arab Emirates. You know, the Germans would be difficult people to approach today, but frankly, in the context of the reconstruction of one of the most important countries of the Arab world, I think we will approach the Germans and many other countries.
Well, what happened to the Germans before was they got caught in a very, very embarrassing situation. They had exported some goods to Iraq that included machinery necessary for the production of unconventional weapons. They were very embarrassed by it, and part of the expiation for what they had done was about $8 billion. That raised the ante for everybody else, the Japanese, for example, and as a consequence, we were able to raise $60 billion of the $64 billion out-of-pocket cost of that war. It looks like now we're in the reverse situation, whereas before the coalition members were paying us money, this time we were having to pay the coalition money substantial.
No, Congressman Spratt, 12 years ago, the weaker members of the coalition, such as Turkey, were getting assistance from outside. The difference, as you point out, the German position is different. But believe me, when Iraq is liberated, I think we're going to find a lot more of what you're referring to. In fact, Germany is one of the largest exporters to Iraq in the world today. Maybe that has something to do with their current position, but it will certainly lead to a lot of opportunity for expiation later. And believe me, from what I heard from Iraqi Americans in Dearborn, the Iraqi people are going to demand it.
Well, let me ask you this. Was the President briefed on Tuesday on the war costs in detail?
I wasn't in the meeting, Congressman.
Do you know if he was? I mean,
I know there was a meeting, and I know they talked about...
You must have formulated some kind of cost. And the reason I'm pressing this issue is that we're getting ready to move a budget here. And the dollar amounts we're talking about for the likely cost of this war are pretty significant. That budget will probably contain reconciliation authority for 2 tax cuts that total revenue reduction totals of $1.3 billion. It might be pertinent to everybody, both sides, to know what the likely cost is going to be before we pass a budget resolution, and certainly before we undertake tax cuts of that magnitude.
Thank you. I'm going to recognize Mr. Thornberry, then we're going to go to Mr. Moran, and then we're going to Mr. Hastings.
Hey, normally I'm a ranking member. I get to...
You know what? You are the ranking member.
Yeah.
And I would...
I got one last question then.
You are the ranking member. Do you want to take advantage
one
of
last,
that?
Yeah, I do. No, I do.
You want to deprive one of these...
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I don't mean
These
to
are good troops.
The gentleman may continue.
Is anybody contributing money to us this time? Do we expect to get any mitigation in the way of money from our coalition allies?
I expect we will get a lot of mitigation, but it'll be easier after the fact than before the fact, unlike the last time. And let me underscore, too, what I said in that earlier intervention. Obviously, the Congress will need to know some numbers, even though they're going to be estimates, because they're going to be dependent on assumptions, and whatever we send up here will be based on assumptions that probably will turn out within a couple of weeks not to be correct. But all of that is if we go to war. There is still some small chance that we won't go to war, and we are at an extremely delicate point in everything that we're doing. And let me underscore it again. It's not just at the United Nations. We're working hard to try to get the UN to stand up to its responsibilities. It is also in putting together a coalition and getting a number of countries that are quite frightened of their own shadows, to put it mildly, and they're stepping up, though quietly, in a very bold way. And in some ways, most important of all, we're sending messages and signals to people inside Iraq. This is part of our public diplomacy, and if you'll forgive us for a few weeks, I think it's necessary to preserve some, what the diplomats call ambiguity about exactly where the numbers are. But obviously, the Congress is going to have to know sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Pratt. Mr. Thornberry, then we're going to go to Mr. Moran, and then Doc Hastings.
Mr. Secretary, I think that most people on this committee and most people in the country are willing to spend whatever's required to have a successful conclusion to Iraq, continuing to prosecute the war on terrorism, but I think we all also want to make sure that money is spent well. You were a little kinder than Secretary Rumsfeld has been. He said the Pentagon bureaucracy is like the old Soviet system, and he's promised to liberate DOD from institutional inertia. I guess I want to ask about some of these kind of a little less sensational but very important management type reforms. One of the issues that affects this committee is the fact that you folks have to start working on a budget request to come before Congress about a year before it comes. Then it takes us about a year to pass it. And then by the time you're spending the money, it's 2 to 3 years after you started putting that budget request together. And yet there are restrictions on how you can move money among accounts and spend it. And sometimes the world changes in 2 or 3 years. I guess I would like for you to elaborate somewhat on some of these management issues that y'all are working on, and perhaps Mr. Zackheim can talk specifically about this moving money around and the challenges that poses in a world that changes very quickly.
I appreciate your asking that, and it was a very important part of my testimony, and maybe if Congressman Shays had given me a little more time, I could have been as unkind as my boss. I mean, I have commented at times that we run the most efficient Stalinist system in the world. I mean, it is efficient by the standards of such centralized systems, but we need ability. For example, a budget in any business is a set of targets. It's a plan. You know, no plan, as they say in the military, survives first contact with the enemy, and budgets don't survive contact with reality. When a business encounters changes, it moves money around. When we need to move money around, we are still living within antiquated limits. Currently, in the procurement accounts, we need to go to, is it 8 different committees, Dove, to get approval to move anything more than $20 million out of a $379 billion defense budget. That's just an invitation for the worst kind of micromanagement, not only up here, but among our proliferating staffs to deal with things that none of you, none of us are really going to have a look at. You know, Congress has made enormous contributions to the management of the Defense Department, and I think it should be recognized. Go back, you could probably go back further. My memory goes back to the Polaris submarine, which I think would have died in its cradle if it had been up to DOD. It was forced through by this branch of the government. More recently, I think the success we've had with the Global Positioning System and with JDAMs is in part due to pressure from Congress insisting that these were programs that needed to be funded better than we were doing. I'm not saying that all the wisdom lies on one side of Pennsylvania Avenue, but it doesn't lie down in the capillaries, down in the weeds where none of us, none of you, none of us are really going to have the time to look. At that level, we've got to get the right managers, empower them to run programs. When they're not running them right, as happened in a major DOD program recently, you fire them and you get new managers. But you don't try to have staffs run things. It just doesn't work. Doug, would you like to add to that?
Yes, sir. Congressman, one of the difficulties we've got, quite frankly, is we have a budget that spends about $1 billion a day right now. We have the authority to move funds that would total 2 days' worth, $2 billion. Now, no business could survive that way. As the Deputy Secretary just said, budgets are simply estimates. We cannot cash manage. I know, for instance, Congressman Shays has been very concerned about how we manage our cash. We've done a lot with that. We've brought down problem disbursements, and many other issues we've addressed in probably a more direct way than in many years. But the fundamental problem of managing cash is that we simply cannot move funds around, and it creates all sorts of inefficiencies. I won't take up too much time. I'll just give you one. We are asking for 2 years to spend our operations and maintenance funds. Why? Because if you only have 1 year, as we do today, and there's an imbalance in the accounts, everybody wants to spend that money to get rid of it by the end of the fiscal year. Now, that's nuts. We shouldn't be doing that.
We're going to Mr. Moran, Doc Hastings, and Ms. Hooley.
Well, Mr. Undersecretary, you and the Comptroller are professionals. You know what you're doing. And we both know that you would not be proceeding with this war without having some estimate of the cost. But I think you're deliberately keeping us in the dark. We're finding out far more in the newspapers than we are from you in testimony. If you wanted to go into top secret, fine, do it. But we're the Budget Committee, and we need to know what is going to be requested of us. There was, in fact, a meeting yesterday between the OMB director and Secretary Rumsfeld and the President. We all know that. We don't know what was discussed, but the Turkish ambassador told me yesterday that there has been agreement on $14.5 billion, $6 billion directly, about $1 billion down payment, another $8.5 billion to come later. You could at least tell us what you're discussing. We've talked with the Jordanian people. They have figures in mind. The Israelis have figures in mind. The $12 billion has been cited for months. $4 billion directly and $8 billion in loans. Egypt is going to get money. We have to provide the money. We're being told now that there's no way that we're going to be told what it's going to cost until after you have begun military action. If you were on this side of the podium, you would be asking the same questions, and you would know that the Undersecretary and the Controller know far more than they're revealing. Now, you can respond to that if you want. I've got two other questions, but you know, we're not so naive as to think that you don't know more than you're revealing. With regard to Turkey, let me just make a point. You know the background in Turkey. I agree with you that Turkey is a terribly important ally, not just for its strategic location, but for all the progress that they made, their determination to stay secular, etc. They think they're going to go into the northern part of Iraq, into the Kurdish zone. They say it's for humanitarian reasons. The Kurds know feel it's anything but. If we turn our backs on the Kurds, if we sell out the Kurds for the third or fourth time, it is wrong. And I trust that you are aware of that, and I'd like some assurance that we're not going to do that to the Kurds again. Now, that's Turkey. I've got to speak up on two other quick questions, too, and if you don't want to address them now, we need them addressed for the record. We've been told by Secretary Rumsfeld that he's going to submit legislation calling for a brand-new personnel system for DOD civilians. It's going to be basically the same personnel system that caused the Department of Homeland Security authorization to be held up for almost a year. You're going to take away the collective bargaining rights, et cetera, for civilian employees. I want to get some sense of what you have in mind for that new personnel system that's going to affect 600,000 civilian employees. And secondly, you are in a unique position. You have people working side by side, performing the exact same function, but under different forms of compensation. You're giving twice as much pay raise to uniformed personnel. You did that last year. You're proposing to do it again this year, as you are for civilian employees. I can't imagine that you're able to retain morale when you're doing that, when you're compensating one group twice as much as the other group who are performing exactly the same function. You have more civilian employees at DOD than in any other agency, and you're the one who is directly responsible for them. DOD already took the biggest hit under the Reforming Government Initiative. Over 100,000 jobs were eliminated, and we need to have some idea of what you plan in terms of not only retaining and recruiting the caliber of people that we need, instead of just castigating them publicly because they're committed and they're doing a good job. And I'd like to get some commitment from you that you're going to reward them properly, as though you were a CEO of a terribly important, well-functioning organization.
Let me just step in. That was a 5-minute question with no time to answer. And I'm going to say that we have to decide whether we want all the members to be able to participate. So, Mr. Secretary, I'm going to ask you to answer one or two of those and just leave those other charges unanswered, which a member can do. But you don't have 5 minutes to answer a 5-minute question. So, you know, just please, I'm sorry. But I'd hope members will give a question and time to answer.
Okay,
Mr. Shays, let me just say this is terribly important. It's the biggest element in the entire budget resolution, you know, we have to be limited to 5 minutes. I know that's the Undersecretary's discretion, but it's not inappropriate to want answers to these questions.
These are all extraordinarily important questions, but we have decided as a group, rather than just having 5 people or 6 people ask questions, that we will allow others to as well. I'm going to, with all respect, just go to the next member, and the next member is...
I'll see if there's some duplication. I could try to work answers.
Mr. Doc Hastings, and then Ms. Hooley, and then Mr. Schrock.
But
Mr. Secretary, I'm not going to take all the time with my questions, and so if you want to use some of my time to respond, I'd be more than happy. But I have to say, as one member, and certain budgetary issues are very important when we're in war. You mentioned that in your opening statement that we're in war, and I have to think back what George Washington went through and what the Continental Congress had to do, wondering about the budget of the Revolutionary War that went on longer and what they wanted. I have to think back of what Lincoln must have thought when the country divided. That war went on longer than what he had anticipated. But in the end, the support was there to fund both of those endeavors, thank goodness. And we're somewhat in that similar situation. So I wanted just to say that because we're in a wartime situation, while budgetary issues are important, there certainly has to be some sort of flexibility if we are going to win, and I think we intend to win. So with that, let me change, kind of change where I want to go over what I was talking about here. And first of all, thank you for your efforts on the completion of the 767 effort as far as tankers for our Air Force. I know that is being worked on, and I just urge you to continue to work to bring that to a final conclusion. I appreciate your efforts. You spent some time in your opening testimony talking about reorganizing the Defense Department in a variety of ways, and I want to focus on the new technology and perhaps newer players that could come in with new technology. You said you're going to reform the procurement. You said that several times to responses of questions of my colleagues. I would just like to simply say, can you give me a timeline on that? Well, first of all, are you going to have a process for new technologies, maybe perhaps smaller firms? It seems like all good ideas come from new ideas, new firms. Is there a timeline on the reforms and specifically the procurement process as you go forward?
Well, I suppose, like any process, it's a continuing one. In fact, we've done a lot of reforms already. There was recently a major reform of just our acquisition regulations, and I wish I could remember the numbers, but they cut it from a volume about that thick down to, I think, a 54-page, or roughly. I'll get the numbers for the record, but it was Pete Aldridge's work. It was impressive. And I assume also that probably helps small contractors, because if you've got a bid on something and the price of entry is reading 2,000 pages of legal gobbledygook, you may go and do your business somewhere else. One of our big targets is, we're hoping, though we're really still in the process of consulting not only with the Congress but elsewhere in the executive branch and with the President, to put together a package of major legislative initiatives. And if I can answer you and Congressman Moran at the same time on at least one of his questions, one of the things we are looking at, and there's been no decision yet, and we will be happy to brief any member of this committee that is interested on what things we're thinking about, is to get more flexibility, first of all, in how we hire civilians. Right now, it is such a burdensome and in many ways ludicrous process. No private company would do it the way we do it through the civil service. And it takes so long that good candidates are gone by the time you're able to make an offer to them, especially in a more competitive economy. One of the results of that is that we still have people in uniform doing jobs that civilians ought to do. Another result of it, I think, is we probably use contractors a lot more than would be rational if you could actually get people on your professional payroll. And I want to emphasize, too, as I said in my testimony, the civilians in the department do magnificent work also. And that is another reform we'd like to work on, is something that gives managers the flexibility to pay for good performance. We've had freedom from the Congress in a couple of places, the China Lake experiment notably, where I think some 30,000 people have been operating for quite a few years under a very much more flexible pay system, and it has worked spectacularly well. It not only gives people extra pay, but it also means that those people who don't perform and don't get the same increases often leave, and that boosts morale all around. These are things we're looking at. I think they can greatly improve our efficiency, greatly improve the way we spend the taxpayers' money, but they're not changes that we can make on our own. They obviously require agreement with the Congress, and we are in the process right now of consulting about them.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Hooley, then Mr. Schrock, and then Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, thank you for joining us today about this budget. And let me tell you, before I get to my question, one of the things that I heard, that you actually know or have a range of numbers for what the war is going to cost and reconstruction is going to cost. You're just not willing to tell us at this time.
No, can I correct that? What I'm saying is we can make many estimates. They're different depending on what you assume about how long the war might last, how many munitions you're going to use, what the reconstruction requirements are afterwards. There is not a single number. That was my basic point. We don't know. We can say...
Well, now, wait a minute. If the President's been briefed on the numbers, you've indicated that you really don't want to, you want to keep it ambiguous until after the war starts, and then you'll be able to tell us the numbers. I know there are really good people in the Department of Defense who have had lots of experience, and to not be able to give us a range. Everybody understands circumstances are different, and when something happens, you can say, we didn't count on this happening, it's going to cost us this much more. But to not be able to give us, this is sort of the minimum, and this is the top, you know, with everything going wrong, this is what it's going to cost us, to give us a range, I just think you can do better than that. Let me get on to the question that I have. I've been going to a lot of mobilization ceremonies in Oregon for the National Guard and Reserves, and we've got them spread all over the Middle East. I'm always amazed at how eager these people are to protect our freedom, and I appreciate their willingness to go into war and their families that are sending them off. I'm very close to the Guard. I'm deeply troubled by the administration's budget request. Based on what I've read, it appears that DOD is borrowing $1.5 billion a month from its active duty operations and personnel accounts to pay for the cost of the reserves and National Guards in 2003. It's my understanding that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld has testified that a supplemental appropriations will be required to pay for the activation and deployment of our Guard and Reserve units. Could you please explain to me why we're being forced to borrow $1.5 billion per month from a separate account to pay for the Guard and Reserve deployment, and why don't we budget for these expenses when we know they're incurring? And also, I have a personal interest in many of these young soldiers. Can you assure me that the Guard and Reserve units will receive adequate funding for 2004? Can you identify where the funding will come from in the budget? And then the last question, very quickly, when are you going to be ready to go through an audit and get a clean financial statement?
Do the best I can in time available. We have very good people who do cost estimates, and they depend on the assumptions you give them. There are even very legitimate issues about whether, for example, if you want to measure the cost of combat, whether the number of days, which is an old way of doing calculations, is in fact the appropriate measure in an era of precision-guided munitions. It gets complicated, and some of it, in fact, gets classified. I think if I gave you a range that truly covered the range of possible numbers, you'd say, well, that's so wide a range, it's not very helpful. Let me emphasize, there will be an appropriate point when we will give you numbers and assumptions that go with the numbers, and the assumptions may probably prove not to be correct. We're not in a position to do that right now. On this issue about the $1.5 billion, I think what you're hearing is the estimate. I emphasize it is only an estimate of what the ongoing operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world are costing us in terms of operating expenses and extra people. And some chunk of that, in fact, is the money that we spend for the Guard and Reserve officers that we mobilize. We were able to stop borrowing, to use that phrase. We don't borrow, we call it cash flowing. When we got the extra $6 billion out of the War Reserve in the closing hours of the Appropriations Committee conference, at some point depending on how those numbers go, we may be back into having to cash flow and therefore coming back for more money. But this is one of those huge uncertainties. Even in an operation that's been ongoing now for 18 months and where you would think there is some predictability, we keep trying to find ways to push down the numbers of Guard and Reserve so that we don't have to mobilize people and pull them away from their families. We've had some success in doing that, and as a result, some of our early estimates have proven to be too high. There is adequate funding for the Guard and Reserve in the budget, and there will be adequate funding for one way or another for people we call up. They're serving their country enormously well, and they certainly shouldn't have to pay for it in any way out of their
You did pretty well answering about 12 questions. Excuse me, it wasn't 12, but a number. We're going to go to Mr. Schrock, then Mr. Moore if he's here. If not, it will be you, Mr. Edwards, and Mr. Wicker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Dr. Zackheim, for being here. I'll be very quick. Of all the things you said in here, I think the most poignant was we need legislative relief, probably in more ways than we realized before we came in here, but you need relief, and that's something we need to focus on. Number one, the budget puts $98.6 billion in pay and benefits, which is an increase of a little more than 5.5%. And it funds a range of pay raises, anywhere from 2% to 6.5%. The budget also reduces out-of-pocket expenses for moving from 7.5 to 3.5 for private housing, dropping to 0 in 2005. This is a huge investment for the taxpayer. Is it accomplishing what you want? One, are we keeping the best and brightest? And number three, what do you think we need a draft? Let me add another thing here that I was asked to ask, and it's a good one because I'm interested in this. This budget increases Special Operations Forces by $47 to 47%. Don't we wish? 47% for a total of $4.52 billion. Can you give us what your vision would be for an enhanced role for the Special Operation Forces?
First of all, I think the improvements we're making in covering base allowance for housing adequately and getting people out of inadequate housing are having hugely positive effects on morale. I hear about that from pretty much every commander I visit, and you probably hear it down in your district a lot. And I think some of those things that indicate how you care about people and how you're treating people have a value that exceeds what a straight cash payment might have done. I'm sorry, I should have taken a note. Oh yes, I'm sorry. I think we made some great advances in the last few years with a lot of support from the Congress in being able to correct some of the gap that existed between those absolutely key middle enlisted officer ranks, where some of our most valuable people are and where the private sector was bidding them away fiercely. Those are people who, by most measures I've seen of employment compensation equivalents, were hurting, and the kinds of targeted pay raises the Congress has allowed us to apply have made a very big difference.
Do we need a draft?
Yeah, right. You know, the short answer is no, we don't. We have wonderful people who are volunteering. If we drafted everybody, we wouldn't know what to do with them, frankly. The numbers would just be beyond belief. You know, I will say one thing, and I think I'm speaking for everyone in uniform in saying this. I'm not in uniform. But anytime anybody makes a mistake of thanking me for working in the Defense Department, I say that it goes the other way. It is, at this time, a national emergency. To be able to feel that you're working on the problems that matter most to the country is of enormous satisfaction. And I think the men and women in uniform are volunteering because they feel good to be able to do something for the country. And the more we can find ways for people not in uniform to help the country, the better. But we don't need several million people under arms.
Special Operations Forces.
And Special Operations Forces. We have taken a very broad look at thinking a snapshot history. We had the disaster of so-called Desert One in 1980, the failed hostage rescue mission in Iran, excuse me. We learned a lot of lessons from that. We developed the Joint Special Operations Command. We developed the Delta Force. We developed an incredible ability to go to a specific place and rescue people. The war on terrorism has demonstrated that we need an additional kind of capability, that not to go to just one place where you have a lot of time to prepare and plan with one specific force that's just trained to the edge for that, but the ability to respond on a global scale, to respond not within even a few days, but sometimes within 30 minutes, to be able to go after those most critical terrorist targets if and when they pop up. And I would say that's the short summary of how we're organizing. There are a lot of political and diplomatic and other considerations that go with that as well, but we definitely need our special operators in a way we never imagined them before September 11th.
We're going to go to Mr. Edwards and Mr. Wickers, and if Mr. Scott isn't here, it would be Ms. Capps.
Secretary Wolfowitz, I have twice supported authorization of force against Iraq, and I applaud this Bush administration and you for fighting for increased defense spending that I think is necessary for our national security. But I was appalled at the recent budget administration proposal to cut $141 million from the important Impact Aid military education program. In my district, which includes Fort Hood, as you know, an installation where 12,500 troops have already been given orders to ship out any day now to the Iraqi theater, might have 30,000 soldiers leaving if 1st Cav Division is deployed. At that area, $31 million of funds would be cut from the 2 public schools that educate the large majority of those soldiers' children. And frankly, last week, as I spent 3 to 4 days there at Fort Hood talking to the soldiers about to be deployed, the wives, the spouses, husband or wife, the children, frankly, I had a hard time explaining that to the children, as your mom or dad are getting on that airplane to go fight for our country, perhaps putting their life on the line, the administration is saying it's okay to be cutting the children's education fund back at home. And these cuts would be dramatic. Massive teacher layoffs, many education programs would have to be reduced. Now, in fairness, you were not part of putting together that Impact Aid request. It came, I assume, either out of the Department of Education or OMB or collusion between the two of them. But while you didn't create the problem, I know you understand as much or more than anyone in this room that at a time of war, we need high military morale. And our soldiers will have enough to worry about if they're fighting in Iraq. They shouldn't have to. It'd be immoral to have them worried about their children's education back at home. My question to you, sir, would be, would you be willing to use your influence to try to put this proposed cut, dramatic cut in Impact Aid, to rest before we commence a possible war with Iraq, not after? We don't need to let this morale problem fester for the next 6 to 9 months. I think it could be devastating on the morale and the feeling of, in fact, I just think it caused a lot of our soldiers to think that our country has a lot of gall to ask them to fight for us while we're not willing to educate their children back home. Any thoughts on that? Can you help us on that?
As you correctly pointed out, Congressman Edwards, it is in a different department. And I guess my first reaction is to say absolutely the morale of our families is a critical thing, and we need to think about it as we go to war. My second thought is I know how hard it is balancing the priorities in the Defense Department with what some people think is a large, but we don't think a large increase. The other departments are facing that challenge with more or less flat funding levels. So I don't know what Department of Education had to balance. I think it is fair, I don't want to go any further than that, for me to at least undertake to talk to them and see if they did think about that adequately.
I hope you would, and I hope you would do so aggressively, because while the Department of Education isn't under your direct jurisdiction, you're part of the leadership of this administration that the American people are entrusting to carry out this possible military conflict in Iraq. And I think it has a direct impact on the morale of our soldiers, and I can tell you that, having met with many of them, I think it's morally wrong to send soldiers and servicemen and women to war while we're cutting their education funds back home. And I certainly couldn't look them in the face and say we could propose a $700 billion tax cut, but
for people sitting here safely at home over the next year or two while they're being asked to fight for our country, but yet we can't afford to educate their children. I would urge you to take whatever time you could during a very busy time for you to pursue that. My final question would be this, if we have time to answer it. Given this administration's request for a $700 billion tax cut, does the Bush administration still oppose full funding of concurrent receipt for military retarees?
The short answer is yes, and it's a long and difficult issue.
We'll have you give him the long answer later, okay?
Okay.
I'm sorry. We're going to go from...
Can I just say, because at the end of the day, it comes out of things that we need for our active duty people.
Mr. Wicker, then Ms. Capps, and then Mr. Putnam if Mr. Barrett isn't here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wolfowitz, I want to try to squeeze in two questions. First of all, there is no question we're making significant increases in the defense budget as a result of our security needs. Indeed, of the discretionary spending, defense is well over half of that figure. You testified in your prepared statement that 45% of the defense budget goes to cover personnel costs for our men and women. I'm sure that that's a proper amount. My question is this, or my first question. As larger increases go to personnel and operations, there is a concern that the percentage of the defense spending year after year for research and for procurement appears to be shrinking. Would you comment on the long-term implications of this pattern?
I think we are, in fact, bringing up overall our investment accounts. There is some debate about the S&T portion of that. But when we say investment accounts, we mean science and technology, research and development, and procurement. And we have been bringing up those numbers, not as fast as we would like because of the considerations you mentioned about the cost of people and the cost of readiness. But we have been bringing them up. And I think by making some hard decisions, we've been able to move some of that money into the places where it's better needed. The Navy, for example, this year is retiring several quite usable surface ships early in order to save operating costs to invest in the Navy of the future. I think that was an absolutely sound judgment, but we have got to make some of those kinds of choices. Some of these numbers shift around because quite a few of our programs, especially the tactical aircraft programs, have been in R&D for a long time. The F-22 is just entering the procurement phase. The Joint Strike Fighter is still in the R&D phase, but it will soon be in a procurement phase. So you would expect money to shift between those accounts. But I would say overall we are increasing the investment accounts. Would we like to increase them faster? Yes, but I think we made the right set of decisions in balancing among priorities.
All right. Well, let me then shift to a question about reserves. And I know we've already talked about this in this hearing, but my concern is the over-deployment or the overuse of our reserve forces. You and I have had a conversation earlier about this, and I agree with Mrs. Hooley. It's just amazing the enthusiasm that we see at these deployment ceremonies. But when you see units coming home from an 18-month deployment and then having to turn right around and go back again, I just wonder if we're going to have to look down the road at increasing our active duty force even more than you've projected, so that people will be willing to stay in the reserve for that occasional call-up that we've sort of been facing over time.
Two comments. Number one of the reasons we're making such a strong push to have more flexibility to hire civilians and to make better use of the civilian workforce is our estimate is we have some 300,000 people in uniform who could be, who are basically performing civilian functions. And before we start adding to end strength, which is extremely expensive, I think we ought to look at whether more of that could be provided from the civilian side. And the second point to make is that I think some of the worst stresses in the reserves come from those units. We developed this euphemism in the Pentagon called low density, high demand, which Rumsfeld says that just means something we didn't buy enough of. And one of the things was a whole lot of units that come out of reserves. And so there's no other place to go for them. And we need to fix that. We need to have the right kind of density proportional demand. And I think we really need to rethink about some of these functions that were put largely or entirely in the reserve forces.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We'll go to Ms. Capps, then Mr. Putnam, and I think, Mr. Ford, I might have skipped you. I think you're next, and then it will be Mr. Emanuel after that on your side. So, Ms. Capps, you have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I wish to turn to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, if I may. I strongly believe that U.S. concerted efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today would help build international support for our efforts to disarm Iraq and to fight global terrorism. The biggest obstacle to peace is Palestinian terrorism. All forms of terrorism must cease once and for all. Another obstacle is Israeli settlement policy. The West Bank and Gaza lands given over to settlements make it more and more difficult to envision President Bush's vision, which he articulated again last night, and I quote, 2 states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace. Settlements are not only a political issue, but a tremendous drag on the Israeli economy and military. Last night, the President